The hot topic right now seems to be the Israeli Palestinian conflict, and every Tom, Dick, and Harry are giving their uninformed opinions about it. Well, they are allowed to, and I'm allowed to critique and criticize their uninformed opinions. One of my friends on Twitter, who happened to be Jewish, recommended that I watch an episode of The Glenn Show with the black guys of bloggingheads.tv, Glenn Lowry, John McWhorter, and their surrogate son, Coleman Hughes, where they analyzed the current Israeli Palestinian conflict. The conversation revealed three interesting things. One, Coleman Hughes is a baby intellectual who makes weird analogies. Two, John McWhorter is a lazy thinker who analyzes everything through an American racial framework. Three, Glenn Lowry has a better understanding of the conflict, but as usual must perform for his audience. So this video would be more of a critique of John McWhorter than anyone else. Full disclosure, there were points in the conversation where I agreed with John McWhorter, such as when he stated that Israeli carpet bombing of Gaza was only going to lead to the breeding of more extremists in Gaza. So I'm going to cut out most of the places where we agree and go straight to the places I find problematic. I would advise everyone to go watch the full episodes, which I will link in the description of this video. Now that we've gotten charity out of the way, let's get down to business. The segment starts out with Glenn Lowry laying out a background of the recent conflict and asking John and Coleman to share their views. He mentions that none of them are experts on the topic, which I thought was a good caveat to preface the conversation.
Speaking of what cannot be not addressed, we're here on October 14th, 2023, exactly 1 week after October 7th, which was the day just a week ago on which the Hamas terrorist organization launched a historically unprecedented, massive assault against civilian targets in the south of Israel, killing many hundreds, kidnapping, mutilating, desecrating, slaughtering men, women, children, elderly, etc. I could go on. I think everybody in earshot knows what I'm talking about. And I just feel like we probably ought to close our conversation out here today. None of us are necessarily experts on this particular subject matter in foreign policy, but we are citizens of this country and of the world with some commentary about these events. John?
John McWhorter goes first with his answer and straight away conflates pro-Palestinian support on the left to mean pro-Hamas support.
I've been very struck by a lot of the social media commentary from the left about this particular thing that Hamas did. And I've also been impressed by how many of them have pedaled it back in view partly of how truly horrific the data has come to be, and then also for the less admirable reason of just not wanting to be roasted on social media for heartlessness. But the idea that Hamas was justified in the extent of what they did, not just a few missiles, I hate to say not just a few people murdered, but that was justifiable because they are the oppressed rather than the oppressor in this situation. What I see is a laziness among a certain kind of thinker on the hard left. And that's basically that the world is about white people and black people, white of various kinds and black of various kinds. And Hamas and the Palestinians in this case are seen as the black people, and the Jews are seen as the white people. And the idea is that you can do anything, that anything is justified in order to get the quote unquote white person's boots off of your neck.
What I see is a laziness on the part of John in failing to make an important distinction that pro-Palestinian support is not the same as pro-Hamas support. Most people agree that Hamas is a terrorist organization and that their actions are indefensible. I won't deny the fact that there have been pro-Hamas support as well, a notable example being BLM Chicago, which was just an utterly tasteless and insensitive thing. But the truth remains that most of the support from the left have been for Palestinians, not Hamas. But John couldn't be bothered enough to make such a distinction. Does John McWhorter have any other examples apart from his standard the left thinks white people are bad and black people are good analogy? His imposition of American racial narrative on this conflict reveals not only a lack of understanding, but a laziness to think of better comparisons or examples to explain leftist support for Palestinians. Do the left support Palestine simply because they see Jews as the white oppressors and Palestinians as the black oppressed? Or do they accurately support the Palestinians because they understand the grave injustice done to them as a result of the formation of the State of Israel in 1948? I think John McWhorter assumes this type of thinking on behalf of the left. Not everyone is as obsessed with parallels of racial narratives as you, John.
And I completely understand that Israel has blood on its hands as well. But Hamas started this one and in such an extreme way. And yet there are people who would actually sit there and applaud that kind of butchery, including people who Hamas themselves would have nothing but disgust for and might even consider interfering with their being living people. For anybody who's gay to cheer on Hamas because they're coming from the left, for example, how long would they last in Gaza? What kind of life would they have led?
Really? Hamas is a leftist organization? Oh wow, Americans and their labels. Hamas can be best described by their actions as a right-wing, ultra-nationalist, Islamic supremacist terrorist organization. Nothing about them resembles the left in any sense. But here is John McWhorter making such a silly argument that Hamas is coming from the left. Then he goes back to the racial parallels.
I find it lazy. I find it lazy as, Glenn, you'll get this one, cheering the rioters on in 2020 because people tearing down their own neighborhoods because of George Floyd. Because they're black, it's okay to tear down your own neighborhood. And you see this sort of thing again and again, this idea that if the person is oppressed, then it's okay for them to do things that would chill you to your socks if you saw the oppressor doing it, even if the oppressor was doing it much, much less.
Oh, this is just like people on the left cheering BLM riots following the killing of George Floyd. Talk about an unsophisticated analysis. Talk about lazy thinking. John McWhorter could have done a better job by looking at the history of the conflict to understand why anyone supports the Palestinians. But he thinks the only reason people can support the Palestinians is because of the oppressor versus oppressed narrative. Truly astonishing.
And it's disturbing because it's condescending. Basically, you're saying that Hamas, having no responsibility for their actions, oppression has made them less than fully human and beyond responsibility. And because Black Americans are seen that way so often in so many situations, it irritates me.
John, these racial parallels do not work. The Palestinian issue is a whole different animal. Who exactly is saying Hamas is not responsible or should not be held responsible? It seems to me that the sentiment on the left is that the attack did not happen for no reason and that the issues that led to this attack should be addressed. Explanation is not justification. When someone explains why a terrible thing happened, that person is not automatically justifying the terrible thing that happened. Listen to journalist Vishal Shabi explain this point.
There is a wider context here, and we have to look at it. And I want to be clear that to explain is not to justify. There's no justification for what Hamas just did in Israel. It was mass, indiscriminate slaughter. The images coming out of southern Israeli towns, Kfar Aza, Kibbutz Be'eri, are images of hell. And Israelis are traumatized, and so are Jews. We're looking at a decades-long military occupation by Israel of Palestinians, which is deadly and causes misery and suffering every single day. We're looking at a system which human rights organizations, including the Israeli B'Tselem, including Amnesty, have described as apartheid. We're looking at every aspect, every peaceful means to reach a resolution, whether that's diplomacy, whether that's politics, whether that's law, blocked by the international community.
As usual, John McWhorter is blissfully unaware of this. He feels comfortable using Black Americans as punching bag for his rhetorical narrative. And this is why I stopped watching the Glenn show, because it was basically the same race talk every 2 weeks. Next to go was Coleman Hughes, whose analysis was slightly better than McWhorter's, but fell flat all the same.
I don't know if you saw this tweet going around. It was like, what did y'all think decolonization meant? Vibes?
And yes, I saw that tweet. It was a terrible tweet that seemed to justify violence, and I wholeheartedly condemn it. But let's go back a little bit. What exactly did you think Israeli colonization of Palestine meant? Vibes? The answer is obviously no. The Israelis colonized Palestine with force, in which innocent people were killed and many more were driven from their homes and properties. Before the formation of the State of Israel, Jewish militias terrorized Arab villages and poisoned water wells in Palestinian villages with typhoid. A Jewish terrorist group called Argon carried out the King David Hotel bombing in Jerusalem in 1946, in which close to 100 people were killed. They carried out attacks on British troops as well as against Arabs. So yes, the colonization of Palestine was done not on vibes, but on violence. Now, before you say Israelis did colonize Palestine, you probably need to hear it from the founders of Zionism themselves, who described their movement as a colonial movement. I recommend everyone read Judenstaat, a book by Theodor Herzl, the spiritual Zionist founder of the State of Israel. Listen to a passage in the biography of Herzl. Quote, he went to Paris and had a talk with Baron Edmond. Baron Edmond was older than Herzl and felt ill at ease in the presence of a calm critic of all he had done for Jewish colonization in Palestine. Baron Edmond did not believe it possible to create political conditions favorable for a mass immigration of Jews. He clung to his idea of slow colonization, attracting no attention and careful not to provoke hostility. In the early stages of Zionism, the idea of a Jewish state in Palestine was not a very popular one amongst European Jews. When Herzl published The Jewish State, the Jewish controlled press in Germany took a negative attitude to it, some describing it as a madness of despair. Even Herzl himself did not at first see the utility of a Jewish state in Palestine. He writes, quote, it is childish to go in search of the geographic location of this homeland. And if Jews really returned home in quotation marks, he continued, one day they will discover on the next day that they do not belong together. For centuries, they have been rooted in diverse nationalisms. They differ from each other, group by group. The only thing that they have in common is the pressure which holds them together. Herzl correctly understood Jews to be of different nationalities, that is, Russian, German, English, French, etc., with the only connecting strand being the external pressure of anti Semitism in their respective nations. Israel was born out of a necessity to escape the rabid anti Semitism in their countries. If the Europeans were not that anti Semitic, European Jews would not have had any need to leave their country to go colonize another people's land.
I don't know if you saw this tweet going around. It was like, what did y'all think decolonization meant? Vibes?
That was the first one that got me. Yeah.
That's literally just a full excusing of slaughtering civilians on account of the goal being decolonization. Now, this gets to one of the deepest and I think most important questions when you're looking at this conflict or any conflict, which is what are the actual end goals of each side? I was thinking about this the other day. When we think about World War II, nobody says, what a horrible war. I'm thinking about the innocent loss of life on both sides. And that would be an appropriate reaction, but it's not how we tend to think about World War II. We tend to think, thank God the Allies beat the Nazis and prevented them from building a genocidal empire. In other words, we think about the goals of each side of the conflict, knowing that waging war entails terrible things in general.
Coleman, your analogy would have worked if this was World War II or anything similar. I think a better comparison would be apartheid South Africa, not World War II. A counter to Coleman's point would be certain reaction to the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Japanese were absolute monsters, even much worse than the Nazis in World War II. But there were those who argued that the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was unnecessary as the Japanese were already defeated and couldn't hold on much longer. So, even at that time, people understood that indiscriminate bombing of enemy civilians is not an okay thing to do. Coleman is providing one of many possible narratives and presenting it as though it's the only one.
If you ask what really are the end goals of Hamas and what are the end goals of Israel, I think you come to two very different visions.
It's not clear that the goals of Hamas and Israel are all that different. But hear me out. Hamas wants an Arab dominated ethno religious Islamic state. Israel, on the other hand, also wants a Jewish dominated ethno religious state. The Jews achieved theirs with violence by conquest in 1948. The Palestinians are seeking to achieve theirs with violence as well. And I know many people would say, but they are Arab citizens of Israel. Yes, of course they are. Their numbers are not a threat to Jewish political and national interests. That's why they are tolerated. If Israel had not pushed out Arabs and simply just formed its state with the ethnic makeup, Israel today would have currently been an Arab dominated independent state with a Jewish minority, just like in Syria and in Iraq. So, how did the Israelis achieve this Jewish dominated state? Guess? Violence. Jews and Arabs have always lived in relative peace in Palestine before 1948. The Arabs did not try to genocide them then. Arab hostilities only started when they realized the plan to divide their land and create a Jewish state on most of it.
I think that Hamas wants to do what it did on October 7th, ideally, to every Jew in Israel, eradicate them by any means necessary, and then establish a Palestinian Islamic State over the whole land. I think
And
that
one
is their
clue,
goal.
and one clue that you're correct is that they say so.
Hamas's strategy and rhetoric is consistent with that of a weaker party in a conflict. If the roles were reversed, the actions would be reversed. If Hamas was in Israel's position, Hamas would be an internationally recognized government and would be sensitive to international law and pressure. They would not carry out full scale genocide because they have the power. They're in control and there wouldn't be a need for that. Of course, they would definitely oppress the Jews, but they won't genocide them. On the other hand, if the Israelis were the weaker party, I would expect similar terrorist behavior from them. As I showed earlier, when the Israelis were in a weaker position, they poisoned Arab water wells with typhoid and carried out terror attacks on Arab villages. Hamas has nothing but their lives to lose in an escalating conflict. They already see how they live as worse than death. Israel, on the other hand, is a sovereign state and has a reputation to protect. So even if it could, it would not go to the same extent as Hamas. If you follow the history of any secessionist movement, you will find similar rhetoric and violence. Paul Kagame, the current president of Rwanda, was a refugee rebel leader who launched an assault on Rwanda from Uganda, where his tribe had been displaced as refugees by their Hutu neighbors. Although it was a bloody conflict of conquest, when the rebels led by Kagame seized power, they did not genocide the Hutus as may have been expected, seeing the Hutus killed almost 1 million of their tribesmen. Today, Rwanda is a peaceful country that accommodates both Hutus and Tutsis, with their president being a former rebel terrorist leader.
I know enough Israelis to know what a kind of Israeli perspective on that question might sound like. And it might sound like something like this. You know, everything we have tried has led to more terror. When we have tried the forbearance, in other words, they unilaterally pulled out of Gaza, which was not, that was a kind of a left-wing decision in a sense. Like they didn't get anything for it. They did what the pro-peace crowd wanted and just pulled out of occupied territory. And they feel what they got in response was more terror.
This is a clear-cut indication that Coleman Hughes doesn't know what the hell he's talking about. Why did Israel pull out of Gaza in 2005? Was it a gesture of peace that the Palestinians rejected? Well, let's hear from the horse's mouth. In a November 2003 interview, Ehud Olmert, Sharon's deputy leader at the time, explained his developing policy as follows, quote, "There is no doubt in my mind that very soon the government of Israel is going to have to address the demographic issue with the utmost seriousness and resolve. This issue, above all others, will dictate the solution that we must adopt. In the absence of a negotiated agreement, and I do believe in the realistic prospect of an agreement, we need to implement a unilateral alternative. More and more Palestinians are uninterested in a negotiated two-state solution because they want to change the essence of the conflict from an Algerian paradigm to a South African one, from a struggle against occupation in their parlance to a struggle for one man, one vote. That is, of course, a much cleaner struggle, a much more popular struggle, and ultimately a much more powerful one. For us, it would mean the end of the Jewish state. The parameters of a unilateral solution are to maximize the number of Jews and to minimize the number of Palestinians, not to withdraw to the 1967 border and not to divide Jerusalem. It was further stated that the Gaza withdrawal was designed to obviate rather than facilitate peace negotiations. Sharon envisaged at that time annexing Jerusalem, the Jordan Valley, and other major settlements, and thereby isolate Palestinians on the West Bank in territory that constituted less than half of what existed beyond the Green Line. Fascinating stuff. For all those who didn't understand what I just read, the goal of withdrawing from Gaza was not a peace move. The word obviate, as used earlier, means to prevent, meaning the move was meant to prevent peace negotiations. But why won't Israel want a peace negotiation? They sensed that the Palestinians were open to a one state solution, and that will mean granting millions of Palestinians voting rights, a move that would fundamentally change the demographics of the Jewish state. Israel wants a majority Jewish state. So much for the tolerance of Arabs. As we also saw earlier, as a follow up to withdrawal, Israel was going to annex other Palestinian territory, such as the whole of Jerusalem, the Jordan Valley, and other settlements. Till today, Israel continues to expand Jewish settlements in the West Bank. With all these things Israel does, the popular narrative is still that Israel wants peace and the Palestinians are the only ones standing in the way of peace. Continued expansion of Jewish settlements is one of the biggest obstacles to peace. You don't want them to be a part of Israel, and you keep grabbing land that they can potentially create their own state on. Yet, they are the ones who don't want peace. The original partition plan was to give Jews 52% of the land and Arabs 46% of the land. Today, Israel contains 77% of the land and is still expanding. Israel says it wants peace, but its actions say otherwise. Actions speak louder than words. In October 2004, Prime Minister Ariel Sharon's senior advisor, Dov Weisglass, explained the meaning of Sharon's statement further. Quote, the significance of the disengagement plan is the freezing of the peace process. And when you freeze that process, you prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state and you prevent a discussion on the refugees, the borders, and Jerusalem. Effectively, this whole package, called the Palestinian state, with all that it entails, has been removed indefinitely from our agenda. Unquote. Israeli agenda for pulling out of Gaza couldn't have been more explicit. So miss me with that nonsense. Coleman Hughes would have known all of this if he took time to do a little research, but he's too busy being an armchair intellectual trying to use common sense to analyze a complex issue. Finally, Glenn Lowry comes in and makes sense, sort of, accurately making the distinction between Hamas and the Palestinians that John failed to do. He goes on to explain the reason why anyone would support the Palestinians.
Let me say a couple of things. I mean, one thing that occurs to me right away is Hamas is not the Palestinian people. It is Hamas. It's a terror organization. It's an Islamist organization. It is what it is. So those people here in the United States who have sympathy for the plight of the Palestinians, and I'm one of them, need to be very clear about the nature of that organization and the moral clarity to be able to see barbarism and terror for what it is need not come at the expense of being able to sympathize with the historical disaster for Palestinian Arabs, which the creation of the state of Israel, for many of them, has led to. It seems to me no need to choose between those two things.
Frankly, Glenn's part was the only redeeming part in this conversation. It was only Glenn that stopped me from titling this video The Triple Axis of Stupidity. Now, if you're looking for something fun and exciting to read, check out my crime fiction novel, which features a debate on race and colonialism. Grab a copy and enjoy the read. The link is in the description of the video.